I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Matt Lewis, his new book is Last Man Off. Matt is the last man off. A true story of disaster and survival on the Antarctic seas. We're on the Suder Havid. It is 6 June, 1998, and there's a storm up. You feel the wind when you're out on the deck. You talk in terms of Gale 7 and Gale 8 wind, Force 7 and Force 8 winds. That's not as high as they can go, I'm guessing, but it's severe, and there's a roll to the sea. At this point, Matt, you have anxiety about this. What is your thinking early in this wind?
Well, fishermen are always famous for exaggerating their claims, but when I was writing the book, I was trying to make sure that I described the conditions as accurately as I could. And when I was writing in my notebook that day, I can remember describing the conditions as Force 7 and Force 8. When I was looking at the conditions out at sea, the waves were being shredded by the wind, but it certainly wasn't the strongest wind that you've ever experienced. But the waves were huge.
You are rolling up and down the waves. You're going down in the trough and up to the top and then back down. But the Suder Havid is seaworthy. It's not at this point its engines are working, which is always a crisis. So it can keep its bow into the waves, and so no matter how big they are, it can ride this out. You descend into the factory. This begins the crisis point. What is happening in the factory that puts the Suder Havid at risk?
Well, the swells that day were about 10 meters high, so as high as the chimney pot in my house. So the boat was surfing up and down. So going down into the factory, which is enclosed, was quite unpleasant because you're moving that much, but you can't see the horizon. And the problem was that the big swells were hitting the hatches that the line came through and exploding into the factory. So we were taking quite a lot of water into the factory, but the pumps that normally move the water out of the factory back outside the boat, they were clogging with the fish guts and with the scales that were being washed around. So basically we were getting water into the boat, but we weren't getting enough water out of the boat. The boat actually relied on those pumps to get rid of the water overboard. You
saw this. You're the observer. And the men working in the factory also see it. And at some point, they presciently ask the bridge to cease fishing. Would that have done it? If you'd closed all the doors and stopped fishing that day, would that have solved the crisis?
I think if we'd stopped fishing and they'd sorted the pumps out, we could have saved the ship. I think that, we could have just stopped the water coming in, maybe turned and sheltered the boat a little bit, just turned it a little bit out of the weather, and yes, I think we could have saved the Suder Havid.
But Bubbles and Boaty do not respond. They demand you keep fishing, and now it comes down to the money. You're behind. You arrive 3 weeks late to the fishing zone, the fishing season. The first area you chose was not rich. You're pulling all these monsters on board, not as much as you want. And so rather than go back and refuel, you refueled at sea. So you have too much weight on board is how you present this, Matt. Is that right?
Yeah, John, you're right. There was a lot of commercial pressure on the boat, and we'd been hoping to catch more fish, or the skipper had been hoping to catch more, and they were trying to catch up. But I don't understand, still to this day, why, even with all that commercial pressure, they didn't come down to the factory just to see what the situation was, to see the conditions that we were facing. When different men from the boat had gone up to the bridge to say we were having problems, we'd all been ignored and told to go back downstairs. Whatever you're doing, it can't be that bad.
It was that bad, and as the water crashes into Suder Havid and the waves grow, at some point you feel, the way I'm reading this, Matt, you felt that the Suder Havid was no longer behaving correctly. It was settling low. How does it feel when you know the ship is in trouble?
There's a change from her bobbing like a duck, which was her normal motion. She would just bob left and right, just roll around quite high in the water. There was a change as she took on more water, and as the situation got worse, we started wallowing. So as the boat rolled over to starboard to the right, then she'd stay there for a bit, and then she'd come back up. And then she'd go over the other side and stay a bit. So she was wallowing around, just her action had slowed. But also we reached a point where there was just too much water. And at that point I was down in the factory. The water went over to one side, and it didn't come back. And I can remember looking over to the other side of the factory, and the water was nearly touching the ceiling. The fluorescent lights were flickering and sputtering and sparking. And I can remember thinking, oh no,
Right.
Water's not coming back.
All right, so it's settling to starboard, and the emergency is in front of you. You have 38 people on board. Everyone's an experienced seaman, but Matt, who has been at sea, but not in a boat in this much trouble. And you all have this sense that it's time to get up on deck. The factory is flooding, and we can believe that even below decks below that, they're having trouble too. You get up to the crew deck, and it's dry. And so you think that things are going to be sorted out. The crew up, the way I read this, Matt, the crew up above you had already figured out a ship was in trouble. They dressed and they were ready to abandon ship. What about Bubbles and Boaty? Had they in any way given an order to prepare abandoning ship?
No, there were no orders. I think the crew had realized, a lot of the crew had realized that the situation was just hopeless before me, but a few of us, half a dozen of us, maybe 8, had stayed down in the factory just trying to get these pumps started. And I'd come up on deck too late to find, maybe 25 of the crew ready to go. And those of us who'd been down in the factory had come up to find everybody waiting there, all lined up. But Bubbles and Bookie had given no order to abandon ship. There was no siren. There was no, no tannoy announcement, nothing to tell us to get off the boat. They were still up on the bridge. And I don't know what they were doing.
Suder Havid is the name of the boat that's now in mortal distress. 38 human beings on board. The very high seas, they're rolling it through. The engines are still working, but the below decks are taking on water heavily. So it's settling by the starboard. They have to get off. And now to the life rafts when we come back. Matt Lewis is the author, Last Man Off, a true story of disaster and survival on the Antarctic seas. I'm John Batchelor.